Welcome to the DVERT Brief. I'm Dr. Meg McBride, Director of the Domestic Violent Extremism Research and Translation Center at CNA. This podcast series highlights new research, trends, and findings on violent extremism in America. Designed for policymakers, practitioners, and anyone curious about the evolving domestic threat landscape, this AI-generated podcast delivers concise and accessible summaries of our latest work. Thanks for listening.
In today's episode, we'll be exploring key insights from our report, Domestic Terrorists: Contact with System Stakeholders Before Attacks. Let's dive in.
Today we're discussing whether individuals who carried out domestic terrorist attacks had any contact with institutions or authorities before their attacks. Essentially, what percentage of the violent extremist population could be catchable prior to carrying out an attack?
Right. Previous research indicates that many perpetrators of domestic terrorism leak details about their attack. That is, they communicate intent to harm beforehand to someone. Yet we know very little about how often domestic terrorists had prior contact with system stakeholders they might have leaked information to, or what kind of stakeholders those contacts were with.
Exactly. The study draws on data from the Domestic Terrorism Offender Level Database. That dataset includes 320 individuals who carried out non-Islamist terrorist attacks in the United States between 2001 and 2020.
The key finding here is striking. About 62%, nearly two-thirds, had some form of contact with a system stakeholder before their attack.
Wow, that is striking. But let's take a step back for a second to unpack what system stakeholder contact means. The researchers looked at three categories: contact with law enforcement, contact with a mental health provider, and being reported to the authorities for concerning behavior. Essentially, frontline professionals who are well positioned to recognize warning signs in a person of concern.
Starting with law enforcement, just over 51% of the offenders in the dataset had prior contact. That includes criminal records, being the subject of investigations, or other documented police interactions.
And importantly, about 20% were actually convicted of a crime and imprisoned before they carried out their terrorist attack.
What about contact with mental health providers?
25% of offenders in the dataset had documented interactions with mental health providers. Within that group, nearly 19% were diagnosed with a mental health condition within 1 year of the attack, and 10% were prescribed medication during that same time frame.
And a very small subset, 1.88%, had histories involving suicide attempts that led to hospitalization.
Right. What about the third category? Being reported for concerning behavior.
About 11% of the offenders in the dataset were reported to a system stakeholder for some kind of concerning or threatening behavior before their attack. Most reports went to local or state law enforcement, while a smaller number reached federal authorities, like the FBI.
Okay, so let's talk about why this matters.
For sure. One takeaway is that many perpetrators were not invisible. They interacted with institutions, police, clinicians, courts, before committing violence.
But the authors are careful to stress what the findings do not mean.
Yes, and this is critical. The data do not suggest a correlation between mental illness or prior criminal justice contact and an increased likelihood to commit an act of domestic terrorism.
Right. Millions of Americans have mental health diagnoses or law enforcement interactions. Only a vanishingly small fraction commit acts of terrorism. So the study is not about blaming or stigmatizing. It's about understanding opportunities for prevention.
So, how do these findings suggest prevention could be strengthened?
First, we need to improve understanding of what these pre-attack contacts look like. Second, there's a need for enhanced training for professionals likely to encounter concerning behaviors. And last but not least, we've got to increase appropriate information sharing across systems, within limits that protect the constitutionally protected rights of Americans.
Exactly. Not every contact is actionable. A clinician may not hear reportable threats. Law enforcement may observe behavior that isn't illegal. But better training and coordination might reduce the chances that warning signs are missed across fragmented systems. In short, this research shifts the narrative from "they came out of nowhere" to "how can systems better recognize and respond when contact already occurs?" And that's a conversation relevant to policymakers, practitioners, researchers, and the broader public. This podcast was produced with the assistance of artificial intelligence tools, but the content was based on research done by the DVERT Center, which is housed within CNA, a nonprofit research and analysis organization dedicated to advancing the safety and security of the nation. Data collection and analysis for the research brief, on which this podcast is based, was supported by the National Institute of Justice, Office of Justice Programs, U.S. Department of Justice, under award number 15NIJ21GG02723DOMR. Adaptation of this research for the DVERT Brief was supported by the National Institute of Justice under Award 15PNIJ24GK00750DOMR. The opinions, findings, and conclusions or recommendations expressed in this podcast are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect those of the Department of Justice.